Hi, my name is Tara Mundell and I am 11 years old. I wanted to introduce the next speaker, who is an amazing man, because he taught and inspired me in many ways. He was part of a group called the Little Rock Nine, which you will learn about more from him himself. One thing that really changed me, that he taught me, was to forgive. Now, I will speak more about this tomorrow, but people that bullied me because of my skin color are now friends, and they know that they did something wrong because of the lesson of forgiveness. I know that you will be amazed because when I listened to him, even as a kid, I was emotional. Please welcome Dr. Terrence Roberts.
Tara, you forgot to tell them that I'm your Nana. She's my granddaughter.
Hey, Tara. Thank you very much. Wonderful,
Beautiful.
wonderful.
Beautiful.
It was through Malika, Deepak's daughter, that I actually first learned about this conference, and am pleased to be here. And as Tara said, I am a man of peace and forgiveness, but I am also a realist and understand what we're up against. So today we're going to talk a little bit about navigating the racial terrain. And in order to understand what that means, we have to start with you. You have to understand how you perceive this terrain we collectively occupy, these United States of America. The first thing we have to realize is that the terrain is not the level playing field we often hear about. It is composed of many elements, not the least of which is a structured and structural inequality. For hundreds of years, we have built a system of inequality characterized by a lot of things, but the main thing is racism. Now, we want to talk a little bit about both those things, structural inequality and racism. How do they fit together? Because of the ideology of racism, it becomes necessary to create an artificial hierarchy of people. And in this country, the hierarchy has whiteness at the top and black on the bottom, with all the other variations in between. I think we all pretty much know about that. We have some perception of it. That structural inequality is buttressed by law, by custom, by tradition, by choice. It is our responsibility, as we plan to learn how to navigate the terrain, to know the truth about where we stand. I had the unfortunate experience of having been born in Little Rock, Arkansas in December of 1941. I was fortunate, however, to have a mom who helped me understand almost immediately the structural inequality. She saved the birth announcement that appeared in the local paper. All the babies born in and around Little Rock during that week in December were presented to the general public. The list starts off, Mr. and Mrs. Spotswood's Billingsley, daughter Juliet, and he gives the particulars about her size and weight. And that list continues, non-alphabetically, but about halfway down the list, all of a sudden, the obligatory social titles of Mr. and Mrs. suddenly disappear. And when you get to my entry, you find William and Margaret Roberts' son, Terrence. Now, the casual reader of that paper, of that birth announcement, would probably conclude that there's been a printer's mistake, that the corrected edition would appear in tomorrow's edition. However, the learned individual would know in a flash that all of those babies presented as the progeny of individuals who did not merit those social titles are black babies. She also told me that the terrain was filled with a lot of mythology, mythological concepts. One glaring mythology was that of race itself. Race is myth. There is no basis in reality for it. There is no biological support for it. it is born out of the mentality of those who would support the hierarchy. That's problematic for us. Why? Because most of us, if asked, would say, I am a member of fill-in-the-blank race. Where does that come from? I think it comes from the toxic drip that we're all hooked up to help us accept this structured inequality. One of the other things that my mom taught me was this, that because of the pervasive belief in the mythology that those people who believe differently would be seen as outliers. So practically all of my life I've been rather an outlier. I was talking about these things to a group not too long ago in West Los Angeles. A woman raised her hand in the group and she said, you know what, Terry Roberts, it's all your fault. If you would sit down and shut up and stop talking about these things, then all of a sudden the bigots would die off and the rest of us would get on with life. I questioned her logic. Another element that we see in the terrain is the myth of the equality of opportunity. A lot of us believe in that one. On a trip to colleges and universities with my second daughter a few years ago, we stopped in at Yale University. Bart Giamatti was then president. He said to all of us assembled there, parents and prospective students, some of you probably think that we here at Yale will admit your students based on his or her SAT score. That is not true. You may very well line up across the nation according to your SAT score from highest to lowest, but we will start at the top and we will work our way from top to bottom asking one simple question: do you possess outstanding athletic ability? Once those students or prospective students have been identified, we pull them out of line immediately, put them on air-conditioned buses, and send them to dorms to begin preparing. Next, we ask another question. How many of you have parents or grandparents who have donated large sums of money to this university? The third question, do some of you have parents and or grandparents who are graduates of this university? And at that point, he looked out at the audience and he said, now some of you parents are probably thinking, oh, okay, now it's my child's turn. No, wait. This year, we're graduating the oboe player. She's a senior. Do any of your kids possess outstanding ability playing the oboe? My daughter and I looked around, and there were a lot of gaping jaws and bulging eyes because there was a surprise at this. The two of us were fairly sanguine because we already knew about the structured inequality. We had prepared in advance for it. Another one is this myth of meritocracy. You get what you earn. Unfortunately, the national narrative is such that we get a picture of things that is also unreal, mythological. The national narrative would support all of these things. The myth of meritocracy is such that we get in school, in our communities, messages that if you work hard enough, you will reap the just rewards. Not true. I perceive perhaps some of you in the audience right now, though, are thinking about anecdotal evidence that refutes what I'm saying. Hold on to that. Don't let it go, but keep in mind that it doesn't count. It doesn't count because there are always exceptions, but the exceptions are by far not the rule. One of the things I learned when I was in grade school was about manifest destiny, another myth, that those who came to these shores from Europe were given the manifest destiny, a commitment from God himself to occupy this land from the Atlantic to the Pacific, disregarding the fact that much of that land was inhabited by tribal nations, disparate nations, which historically now have been subsumed under the one rubric of American Indian, as if somehow we could take this group of different people and smush them together and treat them as we did. The fact is, we did do that. That is the kind of terrain we're talking about. How do we learn to navigate that? And it's important for us to understand these steps, a simple four-step process, starting with awareness, or consciousness, you might say. having the awareness of what it is we're dealing with, not accepting the rhetoric from the national narrative. It's hard to do because all of us are baptized into that so-called mainstream, which in truth is a stagnant pond, polluted with racism and its related brothers and sisters. Hard to shake that stuff off because you get it so early. I truly feel blessed to have learned about this stuff fairly early in life because it has helped me navigate with some success. I don't buy into the national narrative, which gets me into trouble a lot because I defy the logic that says we must believe in the ideal to undergird it so that at some point it becomes reality. I think we have to challenge the myth. I think we have to say no to those who are purveyors of the myth. I found out early on that it is important for us not only to challenge the myth, but to have the courage to stand up to those who would co-opt us or kill us if we don't agree with their philosophy. One of the things that crossed my mind as I was thinking about coming out here today was whether or not to take us into the core of the issue, regardless of the response, in an effort to really bring light to the subject or to play it safer and dance around the edges. I've decided not to dance around the edges, folk. I sat in the back, watching on the screen, listening to the two previous speakers, and I felt a sense of discord, because some of the things I heard, I thought, I must address those, but if I do, I run the risk of tearing into icons, and that's not a good thing to do. But in some ways, I respect that, and I like that in terms of making sure that people can feel good about who they are and so forth. But I think we feel better about ourselves when we face the truth, when we truly understand what's going on. In her book, Michelle Alexander writes about the ongoing historical march from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. That's the truth of the matter. All these other things pale beside that one. Out of slavery comes this legacy of inequality, Jim Crow, and then mass incarceration. You can see the threads. You know, there are some people who talk about history as if somehow that stuff that happened years ago, it is no longer relevant. Not true. History is simply and merely everything that happens in space and time. And those things that happened long ago are simply antecedent to things that happen later, an unbroken thread. So it is important to see and to know that nothing happens without consequence. There are those who would suggest that if we were simply to turn our attention to successful enterprise and seek to build the American dream for ourselves, then everything would be fine. Because at that point, we would prove that we are worthy and that we have a right to these things. We forget about the structural inequality that makes it virtually impossible for masses of people to even participate in that enterprise. When you have young black men who are fearful of walking the streets of New York because of stop and frisk, when you have my own wife who's fearful if I walk out of the house on a Saturday night wearing a leather jacket and a baseball cap, there's something wrong with a society like that. Ernest Becker, social anthropologist, wrote in a book called The Birth and Death of Meaning that it is a task of culture to provide each and every single individual with a firm conviction that he or she is an object of primary value in a world of meaningful action. Culture failed me in that regard, as it fails millions of other kids just like me. When I was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, and learned about the structural inequality, one of my first thoughts was, I've got to get out of here. I didn't know any better. I was young. But as I gained the ability to walk and was able to become ambulatory, made my way into other places, other states. I said, okay, it's widespread, it's ubiquitous, it's universal. There's no escaping it, so I have to deal with it. I heard something very similar reported by a professor of mine at Cal State LA, who said he had been a professor at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, and at one point he decided that he really had to leave the South because he was in a market, and he found himself wondering as he stood in line making his purchase whether or not the young clerk, who happened to be an African-American female, would be able to accurately compute what he owed and then give him the correct change. He said he immediately sought a transfer, and he made his way to Los Angeles. Somehow he had thought, if I stay here too long, I'm going to take on some of these same characteristics. What he failed to realize is that his mental map was all off. Had his mental map been correctly calibrated, he would have known that the South is not confined to this area that we sometimes think of as the southeastern part of these United States, but the South is anything south of Canada. And going to California didn't relieve him of the need to change his attitude and his ideas. Moving from one region to the other was not going to make it any more possible for him to do that. We have to do the transition in the space where we are, whether we are at La Costa or Mississippi, or in that case, Fayetteville, Arkansas. Wherever we are, the task is the same. So the first step in the four-step process is awareness. You coming to terms with your own perception of this racial terrain. What do you see? How do you see it? I talk to a lot of people around the world, and they tell me their stories. They tell me how they see things. And a number of people, those who are, quote, on the right, tell me that I have it all wrong. That it's really not about oppression or racism or structured inequality. It's about innate ability for large numbers of people of color to get their act together. I disagree with that. Awareness tells us how we see it. Now, awareness is quickly followed by step 2, which is to make a commitment to what you find in step 1. If you go naked to the mirror and you find that you are possessed of a mental map that needs calibration, then by all means make a commitment to change that. You can commit at several levels. Level 1 is I'll think about it, but you know right away, even as I say that that doesn't mean much. I'll think about it is synonymous with I'll do nothing. Level 2, I'll try. That's just as bad as level 1. You're not going to try anything. Level 3 has a seductive sound to it. I'll do what I can. But you know the problem with that when people say, I'll do what I can? They're not giving you the whole story. They will verbalize, I'll do what I can, but what they don't tell you, what they're thinking is, I can't do very much. And even if I could, I'm not going to do it for you. Level 4 is where most of us actually spend most of our lives. I'll do what's expected. The legalist position. I had a student once who complained because I asked a question in class that had to do with material that appeared on page 25 of the chapter. The day prior, he'd asked me, what should I read for tomorrow? And I said, well, just read the first 24 pages. I think that's chapter 1. I'd forgotten it was actually page 1 through 25. So when I asked a question about some material that actually appeared on page 25, he raised his hand in honest indignation. Sir, I'm sorry to inform you, but you did not assign that page. He read the first 24 diligently because he was a level 4 person. You see, the level 4 person is somebody you can identify always because he or she will always have a job description somewhere secreted on that person. And when asked whether or not they can do something, they'll whip out the job description to check it to see, oh no, sorry, that's not my job. That's not what we need. We need level 5 people. Level 5 says, I will do whatever it takes. And all of us are level 5 committed people in some arenas. You have committed at the 5th level at some time in your life. I learned that from my own daughters. When they were probably 8 and 6, they came to me as a delegation. Dad, we have to talk. Okay. Their agenda? It is impossible for 2 kids to be ready to go to school by 8 o'clock. We've got to change this whole thing. Okay, kids, I'll take that into consideration. But before you go, I'd like to let you know that we're planning a trip to Disneyland on Saturday. We lived in the Napa Valley. In order for us to get down there and have a full day and really have fun, we're going to have to leave about 6 o'clock in the morning. And they walked away. Saturday morning, 3 a.m. I hear a noise in the hallway. There are 2 kids, fully dressed, having awakened, made their beds, showered, had breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, and packed. They are ready to go. It's 3 a.m. That tells me about 5th level commitment. They really wanted to go to Disneyland. Once we make that 5th level commitment to what we find in step 1, then we're on to step 3. What are the options? What are my choices? And this arena of looking at the racial terrain, the options are there by the billions. We don't know what they are. None of us. Why? Because of our levels of ignorance. None of us know very much. But by pooling our knowledge, we learn more. And that's what we're doing in this conference, by the way. We're pooling our knowledge. But at that point of step 3, it's important to begin to look for the options that can work for you. Now, what will happen? Because step 4 is simply to put into action what you choose as step 3. What will happen at that intersection of 3 and 4? You will discover that whatever you choose at step 3 probably will not work, especially the first time. But that is not a sign that you should quit. That is a sign for you to keep going because you haven't yet found the option that works best for you. It's a process that requires diligence and purpose. And besides, Murphy hangs out at that intersection. Murphy lives between 3 and 4. And you know Murphy. But you know, Murphy says, if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. But he laughs at you at that point because he says, hey, if you're bothered by me, watch out for my cousin O'Toole. He is a really bad one. But the idea is, no matter what you bump into, maintain your focus and get the job done. So, high-level awareness, commitment at the 5th level, choosing the option that will eventually work, and then putting it into action. What does that mean in real terms about navigating the terrain? 1, you can't do it by yourself. You cannot do it by yourself. You can have an idea, but you're going to have to recruit other people. You'll need a cadre of people who are willing to work with you to make the change. We have in this room a critical mass of people who could do it. When I was in graduate school, we had a professor who talked about critical mass all the time. He said, once you have a critical mass of people who are willing to share their expertise and knowledge, together they can move the world. So I believe that's possible. So you can't do it by yourself. The relationship is the vehicle that you start with. Relationship is not well understood at all. But think of this. We enter the world hooked up via an umbilical to another human being. That's your first relationship. And once the cord is cut, your task is to learn how to build subsequent relationships with several others. Often I have this fantasy about real change in this country, and it starts with the dyad. 2 people who are willing to be honest with each other about challenging the status quo. Then, moving from that dyad to another dyad, and there are 4, and then exponentially that continues to grow until you have a community, a state, a nation that is ready to move forward. Will that happen? I'm not all that sure about that. I'm not all that sure. Why? Because the forces of selfishness and greed are overwhelming, folk. Overwhelming. I do a lot of work these days at the Museum of Tolerance in West Los Angeles. Much of the work I've been doing lately has to do with helping police officers develop leadership skills. I am met by a cadre of folk in that profession who lean to the right. I don't know how it all happened, but there it is. The reality is. I was asked one day, off the cuff, what do you think is going to happen politically in this country? Now, this was prior to the election of President Barack Obama. At that point, though, I had determined that this man would probably be elected president. And so I responded, again, sort of off the cuff, well, I'm not that sure, but when President Obama is in office, at that point, those are all the words I said when I heard the mental doors slamming all around the table. All of these police officers shut me off because they were not interested in hearing anything about the possibility of a person like Barack Obama becoming president of these United States. That was frightening to me. But it told me that this task of navigating the racial terrain is fraught with more danger than I realized. One of the things that has come to me also over the years is this, and that is when you push against the status quo, you might wind up endangering your life. Dr. Jones talked about the legacy of Dr. King. It wasn't until he began to alter his rhetoric that he got taken out. As long as he was running around talking about we shall overcome, the powers that be said he's not that much of a threat. But when he began to put together the fact that racism was joined with militarism and joined with the poverty that was so ubiquitous in this country, those words were met with alarm. A similar thing happened with Malcolm X. As long as he was running around talking about white devils, he was fine. But the moment he took that Hajj to Mecca and came back talking a new rhetoric, talking about going beyond this thing called race and looking at people as people, he too was taken out. Now, some might say, well, that smacks of conspiracy theories. I don't think so. I think it has to do with, again, a realistic assessment of what can happen to you when you overstep your bounds, when you begin to say things and do things that will seriously threaten the ongoing status quo. Your navigation of the racial terrain means that you are going to find things that you didn't think were there. You're going to discover things that you won't like. You may feel powerless, but my hunch is if you are willing to spend the time building the dyad, helping to create the cadre, then things are going to move forward in a way that you've never imagined possible. Later, we're going to have a panel of folk out and we're going to talk some more about these things. And what I hope we can do at that point is pool our knowledge and information and further excite you about the possibility of change, because I think it is understanding that change is possible and you being willing to participate in it that can make happen what I think we all want to happen. And I need you to do that for lots of reasons, not the least of which is I have 2 grandsons in the world now. Their names are PJ and Austin, and I want you to remember those names because they are young black boys, and their lives are endangered. And you need to join me in making sure that they have the opportunity to maximize the potential they bring into this universe. That may sound kind of odd to some of you who don't have such thoughts about your own grandchildren, but people like me have those thoughts all the time. They're necessary and important. I implore you to take seriously the charge to join the fight to change the status quo. Thank you.